أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
السلام عليكم. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله وصل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستنصره. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى صحبه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم يا رحمن يا رحيم، اللهم تبرأت إليك من حولي وقوتي وعلمي ومعرفتي، ولجأت إلى حولك وقوتك وعلمك وتوفيقك، فإنك تعلم ولا أعلم يا الله، وتقدر ولا أقدر وأنت علام الغيوب. اللهم افتح لنا أبواب فضلك، وبرحمتك ارحمنا يا رب العالمين. In history, you will find a deliberate and most sagacious teacher. It is not an accident, and it is not likely that God, throughout the Quran, throughout, time and time again, calls upon us to reflect upon history, to study the past of nations before us, and to reflect upon the patterns of human complexity. What makes people come together? What makes people go through a certain path and not another? The very pulse of sociological dynamics and the very record of human conduct. These are not euphemisms, and not simple jargon when we say that people who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it, or people who do not reflect upon their mistakes are doomed to repeat these mistakes. And that a people without a history are also a people without a present, and most certainly without a future. But the khutbah today, inshallah, as has been our practice in these khutb, or at least my practice, is to reflect upon some of what unfolds in our present, and the way that our present seems to repeat mistakes that we have not learned yet from the past. We all know that the genocide in Gaza has not let up. The daily brutality and daily murder unfolding in Gaza continues unabated. And we've all reflected upon the fact, the rather very painful fact, that over 200, well over 200 now, well over 200 million Arabs, Muslims in the Arab world, surrounding a nation of perhaps 7 million in Israel, are unable or unwilling, really doesn't matter, to come to the aid of some 2 million Palestinians that are being starved to death, brutalized, and murdered every day before the entire world. And with all the jargon and all the rhetoric about the hypocrisy of the world, the complicity of the West in this unfolding genocide, the fact of the matter is that it is not just the Arab Muslim population that is either unwilling or unable to do anything about this unfolding genocide, and upon this, or to do anything for to help starving people. But the well over 1.6 billion Muslims in the world are largely ineffective as well. That, as has been the practice of Muslims since the establishment of the United Nations system, Muslim nations, Muslim representatives of various nations give eloquent or not so eloquent, doesn't really matter, speeches in the UN, loudly complain about the plight of various Muslim populations in the world. But when all is said and done, Muslims have very little political weight in the international arena, and very little in terms of the power to represent their own interests or to exercise any real sense of self-determination, leave alone self-autonomy. And again, the unfolding events in Gaza will demonstrate that. The world, again, it has become so tiresome that even just saying it is embarrassing and uncomfortable and shameful. That the world have stood by and seen Israel time and again attack UN institutions, kill UN personnel repeatedly, kill journalists, kill medical personnel, kill civilians, and for all the eloquent speeches given in international institutions, nothing is stemming this genocide and nothing is impeding this genocide. As Muslims, whether in the Arab world or Muslims at large around the world, are proving themselves once again that they hardly have a notion of a one people or one nation united by a common goal and a common interest and a common purpose. And that Muslims, in fact, act as they have been acting since the dawn of colonialism, pursuing very limited and largely self-centered and selfish goals for their nation states, if even that, if the nation state itself is not made subservient to the interests of a corrupt elite that rules the nation state, promoting the selfish self-interests of the elites that represent every respective Muslim state at the expense of the populace at large. So even if we are in a situation where if you have a Muslim country that actually pursues its own interests as a nation state, that's a step better than the norm we see in Muslim countries, and that is a corrupt elite, a despotic elite, an oligarchy ruling over that Muslim country, pursuing its own interests in the name of the nation state, but in reality, it is really the interest of the oligarchic elite that is being pursued at the expense of the nation state at large. Now, in the midst of this, as we witness all over subhanallah, Allah allows events to unfold that ought to educate us collectively as to why we are where we are and what type of moral failures collectively as a people are the primary reasons for this tragic state of events, the extent of powerlessness and ineffectiveness of Muslims at large at the international arena. This is precisely a lesson, a demonstration of this took place this past week or so. Israel, yet again, and when I say Israel here, I remind everyone that to a very real extent, Israel itself has been hijacked by its own dictator, an own corrupt politician Netanyahu and his right-wing allies. Netanyahu and his right-wing allies have had a long public record of racism, bigotry, genocidal language that they get away with because they know how to play Israeli politics. And part of these dynamics is that as Netanyahu experienced a measured and limited amount of pressure from the United States, a very limited amount of pressure, but a pressure nonetheless that Netanyahu is not accustomed to, is not used to. A limited amount of pressure from the United States because of repeated Israeli violations against UN personnel. One of the big issues in international institutions is that UN personnel are supposed to be inviolable. There is a long set of case studies, if you will, or cases. One of the long-standing issues is the UN's ability to protect its own personnel, because the UN relies on the willingness of nations to commit and volunteer their citizens to the efforts of the UN. If the UN is unable to protect its personnel in conflict zones, then the entire project of the United Nations becomes ineffective. Quite simply, when the UN calls for workers and volunteers and employees to be sent to conflict zones to help out civilians or to help out displaced human beings at large, then the UN will get no response. And if the UN gets no response, then the UN is rendered even less effective than it already is. This has been an ongoing issue for one Secretary General after another since the establishment of the United Nations. The inviolability of UN personnel. A step further, one of the ongoing and persistent issues in the international arena is that if UN personnel are hurt in any way, injured or killed, to hold nations that are responsible for these injuries accountable. This is one of the ongoing persistent issues that quite often one Secretary General after another has tried to get superpowers to support the simple principle that if you hurt UN personnel, you must be accountable. In other words, you compensate the families of the victims, you compensate the United Nations itself. In other words, to be responsible for reparations when UN personnel are in fact hurt. Well, right before Israel attacked the Iranian consulate in Syria, This precise issue had become a very hot potato. Israel, since the genocide started in Gaza, has repeatedly killed UN officials, time and time and time again. And but days before Israel attacked the consulate in Gaza, just simply days, the incident known as the killing of the UN kitchen workers unfolded. Israel again, although the United Nations, as is common international practice, when the UN sends workers, the first thing the UN does is to notify warring parties of the exact location and logistics of UN workers. In other words, the UN says, I am sending the following people. Here are the coordinates of where these people are going to be. This area is a safe zone area. Please, all warring parties, respect that principle so that our workers from the UN are not hurt. Netanyahu's government, and let's again all remember that this is a right-wing fascist government, that just before the onslaught in Gaza commenced, was confronted with massive demonstrations by Israelis protesting the fascism and racism and the supremacy, as well as the corruption of that very same government. Because we have very horrible short memories, let's not forget that right before the onslaught in Gaza commenced, there were numerous articles in Israeli media and Western media about the crisis of democracy in Israel, how Netanyahu is doing everything he can to hijack and usurp Israeli democracy and to turn it into an oligarchy where he and his allies are in firm control and where he enjoys impunity from corruption. And that we all know that if Netanyahu is not in power anymore, he will immediately face corruption charges. And it is quite likely, if there is a fair trial, that he'll be convicted, because he is a well-known corrupt politician. Him and his family, not just Netanyahu, but his family members, including his son, who's in Florida, are corrupt politicians. This is no secret. The Americans know it, the Israelis know it, even Netanyahu's allies know it. And the Israeli legal system most definitely knows it. So, anyway, right before Israel attacked the Iranian consulate, yet again, despite the fact that the UN notified Israel, as well as the other side, of the coordinates of where UN workers are going to be, shortly after these workers arrived in Israel and commenced working in what was known as the International Kitchen, Israel again bombed this UN aid center, killing a large number of UN workers. And once again, Israel basically informed the Secretary General that they will not be paying any reparations. And that although it is indisputable that the Israeli government was once again responsible for the killing of UN workers under the most bizarre and absurd claim that somehow UN workers are in league with Palestinians and hiding weapons under their pots and dishes and pans and food centers. A claim that no one, including Israeli representatives in the UN, takes seriously. And let's not forget that right before Netanyahu bombed the Iranian consulate, Biden was on the phone with Netanyahu, this time angry, upset, telling Netanyahu this has to stop. And in fact, not just saying that this has to stop, as the US has repeatedly done after every time Israel has killed UN workers, but this time telling Netanyahu the US is going to support the call for an independent UN investigation, not an Israeli Netanyahu investigation, which is a rubber stamp and simply vindicates Israel pro forma without any real work or any real scrutiny whatsoever. And it looked like that this time the US means it. And because we have incredibly horrible memories when it comes to inferior races to the colonized Western mind, colonized by its own self, by its own racial stereotypes and racial bigotry and racial propensities. The typical Western mind sees the crime as very huge when it involves people that look like them and of their own culture, and have horrible memories and horrible sensitivities when it involves people that are more darker skinned than their own. This has been the legacy since the age of colonialism, since the age of so-called the age of discovery, where Europe colonized the rest of the world and destroyed numerous indigenous cultures all around the globe. Racism has been a staple of the European civilization and continues to be. Okay, so this time, commentators, including American diplomats in the State Department and representatives of the White House, were saying this time we're tough on Israel. This time, we will even threaten to hold back aid if Israel does not improperly investigate the last attack on UN workers. This now has become embarrassing. We keep warning Israel to stop doing that, and Netanyahu basically keeps ignoring us. And lest we forget, it was so serious that Netanyahu was forced to remove several Israeli generals, 3 of them, from their commands, reassigning them to positions away from Gaza. But here is the really shameful part. And I know I'm going to say this, and my Sunni counterparts in the Muslim world will not like it, but the truth hurts. It is not just white Europe that is racist. There is plenty of racism to go around. Arabs are racists when it comes to Persians, and of course when it comes to blacks. And Persians are racist when it comes to Arabs. And racism in all its forms offends God, because racism, as I've said decades ago, and to my knowledge, I was the first to say it, that Satan's crime was indeed racism. When Satan tells God, "You've created me from a superior substance, and hence I am superior to human beings." And God says, "You've committed immortal crime. You cannot be in this holy place where the divine is." And God expels Satan. Whether this story unfolded in a real sense or if it is a symbolic story doesn't matter. The lesson is clear. Supremacist thinking and supremacist morality is unacceptable. Israel knows that because of racism against Persians, that there is a ready punching bag in the Middle East. If you strike that bag, everyone will ignore whatever they're doing and forget whatever issue was detaining them, and will pretty much approve and pretty much praise your crime. So Netanyahu does the same old trick that Netanyahu has been doing for years. The Americans are pressuring me. The Americans are pissed off. My right-wing allies are pissed off because I removed generals in response to American pressure. What do? Let's do what the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Emiratis and the Americans like. Let's strike the Persians. And so Netanyahu bombs the Iranian consulate. Was there any military necessity to bomb the Iranian consulate? Has there been attacks from Syria? There have been attacks from Lebanon. But has there been any attacks from Syria against Israel? No. In fact, Israel has been repeatedly striking Syria for many years without the hint of a Syrian response. Not once have armed insurgents succeeded of crossing the Syrian border to do anything in Israel, leave alone the occupied Golan that was illegally annexed by Israel. We don't even remember the last time this has happened, because it hasn't happened since shortly after the occupation of the Golan Heights. But it doesn't matter, because Israel knows very well that Persian life is expendable. You can kill as many Persians as you want, and as long as they carry the label of the Islamic Revolution or the Islamic Republic of Iran, you'll get away with it. And even more, everyone will be interested in whether Iran responds or not. And that becomes the issue. I often wonder whether Netanyahu, when he goes at night and sips at his alcoholic beverage, whether he chuckles to himself and laughs at the stupidity of the world. It was entirely predictable that the response, the solution to a political crisis, or even a political discomfort, that Netanyahu experienced, that Netanyahu will do what he has been doing for years. He solves every political crisis by killing Muslims. He's been doing that throughout his career. And so he attacks, he does what is clearly illegal under international law. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Immunity clearly states that even if there is a declared war, you cannot attack embassies or consulates. Leave alone attacking a consulate of a nation that you are not at war with, and a consulate of a nation in a host country. But Netanyahu knows it doesn't matter. And that Europe, due to its racism and its bigotry against Muslims, will not insist on the fine print of international law and will suddenly not be offended by the fact that an embassy or diplomats or a consulate has been attacked, that the same Europe that forever declared the Persians barbarians and no better than animals for violating the sanctity of the American embassy in Iran years ago, that same Europe that was supposedly extremely offended by the fact that a journalist was killed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, although they let Saudi Arabia get away with it, that same Europe will happily look the other way when it comes to killing Persians. And so Netanyahu attacks the Persian consulate. And as predicted, Israel is hardly condemned. Leave alone the well-established principle that Israel owes Iran reparations for destroying and killing personnel in its consulate. So Israel doesn't pay reparations for killing UN workers. Israel doesn't pay reparations for killing Persian workers or Persian diplomats, people who have diplomatic status and diplomatic immunity, whether we like it or not. That's the international system. Diplomatic immunity doesn't mean that if you don't like the politicians, you can kill them. And if you like them, you can call them diplomats. Diplomatic immunity means I respect the representatives of a state because you declared them to be representatives. Otherwise, there would be fair game on Israeli representatives and Israeli diplomats all over the world who often have a military background and some association with the Israeli military. Can you imagine if Iran said, well, any Israeli consulate in a country we don't like is fair game to us? We would call Iranians, if they attacked an Israeli consulate anywhere, barbarians and no better than animals. But what happened is that Israel attacked the Iranian consulate. And here is where you see the clear imprint of racism. Hardly a response from the white world, European world, but hardly a response also from the Arab world. In fact, the Arab world pretended as if it didn't happen, as if those who were killed in the Israeli provocation were not human at all. I often wonder, what does God think when God looks upon us? I often wonder, how does God appraise the morality and moral standing of Muslims around the world? The clear sign of hypocrisy, racism, and Muslim bigotry. And from a Muslim theological perspective, the clear moral offense that make Muslims unworthy of God's favor and God's blessings is evident in the way Muslims responded and reacted to what unfolded after the attack on the Iranian consulate. So Iran fires some 300 missiles in retaliation. Iran does actually a diplomatically measured and wise thing. They inform the Americans that they're going to strike so that the Americans can inform the Israelis so that the casualties from the attack are measured and limited. Why does Iran want to do that? For a very logical reason. They don't want an open warfare with Israel, leave alone the Americans. They know that if they fire 300 missiles and there are 1,000 casualties, that they are in deep trouble with Israel and with the United States, that they will force the hands of the United States to then come to Israel's aid and strike Iran. But if the casualties from the strikes are limited, then they know that the Americans will have face when they pressure the Israelis not to respond to the attack. So out of the 300 missiles, all are practically shot down except for some 7. And the 7 strike 2 Israeli military bases, seemingly with no casualties suffered. In the entire Sunni world, the response to this is that this was just an act and theater. And here is where it gets extremely offensive. The only reason that Sunnis responded to this by describing it as mere theater is because of antipathy and hostility to the Shia. The Sunni world hates its own vulnerability. The Sunni world hates its own weakness. The Sunni world knows that although Israel has repeatedly bombed Arab countries, from Lebanon to Syria to Egypt to Jordan, Israel was bombed only once. And that's in the early 90s. I think it was 91 or something like that. When Saddam Hussein, in response to the US forcing Iraq out of Kuwait, fired a few Scud missiles at Israel. But other than that, Israeli skies have been free from, Israeli cities have been free from attack by any Arab country. And the Sunnis all around the Arab world hate their own vulnerability and their own weakness. So they responded to the fact that Israel murdered Iranian diplomats, Iranians who have diplomatic status, and they responded to Iran responding by firing these missiles, some of which did strike, in fact, Israel, by saying, this is just theater. This is just an act. Of course, it is entirely illogical, because an act for what purpose? What is it that Israel and Iran are supposed to be acting about or acting for? Because they are so scared of Sunni Muslims that they want to trick them into thinking that, in fact, Iran is best friends with Israel? Do we forget that it was the Jordanians, Sunni Muslims, who were busy shooting down the Iranian missiles, and that the Jordanians, in fact, acted promptly and effectively to protect Israel, as the Egyptians have been doing now since Sisi came to power, and as the Saudis have done when the Yemenis, the Houthis, fired missiles at Israel. It was the Saudis that shot these missiles down. The fact of the matter is wherever we go, Sunni Arab leaders have become proxies and but client states, no better than satellite states, protecting the welfare of Israel in the midst of a genocide. Israel is committing entire genocide against Palestinians. And what does Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Jordan and Egypt do? They guarantee Israel that there will be no interruption in merchandise, economic transactions, that business will continue uninterrupted. And instead of the Sunni world looking at itself and saying, who are the leaders that represent us? They allow our brethren in Gaza to be slaughtered as they act to protect the interests of Israel and make Israel as immune from any consequences, legal or otherwise, in the international arena. I often wonder, if I was God, what would I think as I gaze upon Muslims? Sunnis hate the Shia, and the Shia hate the Sunnah. And Sunnis hate the Shia so much that in the midst of the unfolding genocide, what I see on social media all the time are, quote unquote, great Salafi scholars rising to attack and expose the Shia and their theology, and how they are worse than Zionists and worse than Jews, in the midst of an unfolding genocide. If you were God, what would you think as you gaze upon us? The things that I hear on Sunni channels about the Shia is beyond absurd. I'll give you but one small example. The Shia, all they do is lament and cry over Hussein and beat themselves. Have you ever asked yourself what the Shia scholars actually say about this practice? What percentage of Shia actually engage in this practice? How many Shias do you personally know in your life that have gone to Karbala and beat themselves or hailed dust upon their own head? A practice condemned even in Shia legal sources. But it doesn't matter. Generalizations and stereotypes about what the Shia are all about is what you find all over the Sunni world. And it reaches the point of absolute moral absurdity when you respond to the deaths of diplomatic representatives and retaliation by Iran by simply saying, it's just theater. They're just acting to try to trick us Sunnis. Why? Because they fear you, Sunni world? Because you actually matter? You actually have any political weight in the world? What is it that is so important about you in the world that would compel these two nations to murder their own citizens just to trick your majesty? Absurdity. And the fact that Muslims are engaged in sectarian hate in the midst of an unfolding genocide is but to our testament to our moral failure as Muslims. If you were God, would you aid a people that are so lost in error? أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. I have several points. As Muslims are yet again busy with the nonsensical divide between Sunnah and Shia, immoral and truly righteous journalist that I've mentioned before, C.G. Wellman, posted a most alarming episode. The title of the episode was India Charged with War Crimes in Gaza. C.G. Wellman appeals to the Muslim world and to the world at large as he warns Muslims that Muslims are at the precipice of a new genocide. Watch the episode if you haven't already seen it. C.G. Wellman. The episode is called India Charged with War Crimes in Gaza. C.G. Wellman talks about how there is an leaked Israeli paper in a governmental plan and a conference called Victory for Israel that was held in Israel, which discussed in detail how Israel is importing Indian workers, some 40,000 Indian workers, in cooperation with the Modi government, to come rebuild Gaza, but this time not for Palestinians, but for Israeli settlers. And C.G. Wellman talks in detail about how Netanyahu's government openly, not secretly, as was clearly announced in this conference, Victory for Israel, which Netanyahu's representatives attended and spoke at, where Israel is openly saying, our plan is to build settlements in Gaza, to annex Gaza, as we annexed so much other of Palestine, and to expel the over 2 million Palestinians to Egypt, to the Sinai Desert. The Egyptians have already built compounds and a huge prison to receive Gazans. C.G. Wellman talks about how Israel is actively planning for the importation of some 40,000 workers from India. In fact, he films Indian volunteers as they go to sign up to work in Israel. But C.G. Wellman discusses something even more alarming, and that is that Muslims are at the precipice of another genocide, this time in India. He mentions something that all human rights workers know, that throughout Ramadan, Muslim mosques in India, in Gujarat in particular, were attacked, and that Muslim students were repeatedly molested and beaten in Gujarat while praying Taraweeh. It happened time and time again as the violence against Muslims in India escalates. And C.G. Wellman says there's another genocide that is going to unfold, this time against Muslims in India. And as C.G. Wellman sounds the alarm about this, there's another micro-level event that speaks volumes, that tells us volumes about us. A young Palestinian kid, if you look at him, he's a kid in his 20s. His name is Saleh al-Ja'farawi. He lives in Gaza. What Saleh al-Ja'farawi has been doing is most amazing. Every time he hears of a new massacre against civilians committed by Israel in Gaza, Saleh al-Ja'farawi picks up his camera, goes to the location and films it, and then posts what he films on social media. For doing this, Israel has openly and publicly been calling for the killing of Saleh al-Ja'farawi and has tried to assassinate him repeatedly. I beg of you, go look at the videos yourself. Look at that kid who will end up murdered by Israel. I am sure of it, because he is in Gaza. But Israel even went a step further in Israel's insanity against Palestinians who exercise any degree of self-autonomy or self-determination. When several assassination attempts failed, the Mossad thought maybe we can get Muslims to kill their own. And an Israeli account owned by a guy called Eli David announced that Saleh al-Jafrawi, the Palestinian that Israel has tried to assassinate several times and who has been filming Israeli atrocities committed in Gaza, is actually a Mossad agent. And the account said that his real name is Shalif Yarif. Shalif Yarif. And thanked Saleh al-Jafrawi for his service to Israel. Saleh al-Jafrawi appears on camera after that, laughing at the fact that the Israelis pretended to leak information about one of their own, hoping because they have not been able to kill this kid, that Palestinians themselves will kill him, believing that he is actually really a Mossad agent. And I sat there reflecting. The entire Muslim world, the entire great Muslim theologians and so-called jurists, all these people who are so learned and spend hours on social media quoting hadith and Quran, all the Muslim organizations, the entire Muslim ummah, all those who are busy talking about a trick played by Israel and Iran, can any of them protect a Saleh Jafrawi? A 20-year-old who has only a camera filming Israeli atrocities. This kid will be killed because Israel will eventually get him, as they have with every person they assassinated. And as we know, they've killed well over 50 journalists since the beginning of the conflict. No aid, no protection. But here's the thing, no ummah. No ummah. There is no ummah for Saleh al-Jafrawi. There are Sunnis who hate Shia and Shia who hate Sunnah. There is idiocy and nonsense. I want to close with a lesson from history. Often, because we are human, we look at this mess and say, there's no hope. But those who know history know that it is the height of hubris and arrogance to say there is no hope. Recently, I read a book that moved me beyond words. The book is called Why the Bible Began, an Alternative History of Scripture and Its Origins, by Jacob Wright. And it's really not an alternative history. Jacob Wright says what other historians have said, but he just says it in a more effective and succinct and clear way. When Babylon defeated the ancient state of Israel, invaded the ancient state of Israel, destroyed the ancient state of Israel, and sacked and destroyed the Jewish temple, Jews suffered a genocide of atrocious proportions. It's ancient history that unfolded some 2,500 years ago, so the details are always murky. But we know that in terms of human plight, the genocide that Jews suffered some 2,500 years ago was atrocious. I don't know what else to say. Jews were starved to death, slaughtered, murdered, and ultimately enslaved. The defeat of the state of Israel was total and so complete as Jews were driven in captivity back to Babylon. The response of Jews in diaspora was to affirm the idea of an ummah, of a nation, and to do so, not the heroes of this battle were not those who took arms against the state of Babylon, but were Jewish scribes who philosophized the defeat and philosophized the promise of God, and in short, wrote the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, in response to that defeat. Could they have imagined that the narratives about the pain of defeat and the promise of God would lead to a Jewish victory 2,500 years later? Brothers and sisters, this is God's time. You want victory in your lifetime, but that's not God's time. God's time could be quite easily 2,500 years later. But the great act of moral courage in responding to the defeat by affirming the Ummah in text, affirming the Jewish nation in text, in imagining and scribing and writing the text of the Bible, is what saved the Jewish nation and the Jewish people throughout history. The heroes of the story were scribes and scholars. As the heroes of Jewish identity through history were scribes and scholars. I wish we become good students of history and learn especially from the history of others. I believe that the heroes of the Muslim plight and the heroes of the Muslim future will be also scribes and scholars. Those who affirm the Muslim Ummah and the Muslim nation as a moral principle and refuse to fall prey to the ignorance and bigotry of sectarianism, nationalism, ethnicity, and war races, who rise above it and write for the sake of God, even if their fellow humans fail them time and time again. اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم ارحمنا اللهم تب علينا اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا علي يا عظيم. Allah, forgive our sins. Guide us to the straight path, to the path of light, illumination, and enlightenment. God, aid us in discharging your covenant and in meeting our moral obligations that we will ultimately be held to account for in the hereafter. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. اسألوا الله يستجب لكم وأقم الصلاة.